This is that Marshall DSL40C that had been on fire with all the charring around this tube socket and all the black stuff everywhere. I've got it all cleaned up pretty nicely. I've got some new Belton Michael X sockets in, all the wiring redone. A change to the cathode wiring. I'll talk about that in a minute. That burned wire has been spliced. The blue spliced to blue with heat shrink over that. The black spliced to black with heat shrink over that. And then this larger bit of heat shrink over the entire junction for reliability. And you can see the new 5-watt 1K screen grids mounted well up above and slightly to the side of the tube. That's going to not ever have the problem that the old ones had. It's going to handle any heat. While these could get damaged in the case of a massive tube failure, it will last long enough to probably give the fuses time to react. And I don't know if you can see it here. You'll see it in a subsequent shot, but I've got some 3 kilovolt flyback diodes here from plate to cathode that will really help. Here you can see the diodes better. They're not bulletproof, but they do substantially reduce the risk of arcing, particularly with the new production EL34s. If you looked at the previous video, you will have remembered that each tube had an individual wire from its cathode to here and a cathode to here. Those went through some 1 ohm resistors to ground, circuit ground, not chassis ground. There's a difference in this model. I would have recreated that, but the previous tech had replaced these two. I assumed that in the failure history of this amp, the original screen grid resistor had a failure, and the previous tech had poorly replaced that, and that's what caused the immolation. I think with this lead touched something it should not. That's one possible cause. But anyway, whatever damage took out the old screen grid resistor also damaged those 2 1 ohm resistors. And the previous tech had replaced them. But in stock form, those have been 1 2-watt resistors and that fit in that space. The previous tech crammed some 5 watts in there, and they were physically too large, not just in height, length, width, but also the diameter of the leads. And in the process, the previous tech really damaged this pad. There's not a good connection here, and it was really ugly work. They also managed to burn this capacitor, but it's just the plastic. They burned it by touching with the iron. The capacitor is still fine. The plastic's still intact. It's just not pretty. And I tested all this, make sure there's no problem with these caps. There's no bias leakage or anything. But anyway, given that this pad was damaged, and this is, trying to keep the cost down on this repair, I just bypassed those 1 ohm resistors because I do not need the 1 ohm resistors to bias a Marshall. So cathode to cathode, that's pins 1 and 8 on each tube, to the circuit ground here, all well and good. Now, I had this 270 ohm 10-watt resistor already, and I didn't think much about it until I went time to put it in here. Usually I can use this style even with this narrower lead spacing on Marshalls, but on this model, these quick connects are in the way. It's physically too long, won't fit in the space. So this was a tempt-in thing just to test the amp, and I have one that should fit that properly on order from DigiKey. So, my bad. Usually this works fine in Marshalls. It's an odd choice they made. This is where you could also, instead of using a resistor, you could put in a choke, but I don't think it makes much difference in this model. So the new 90-cent resistor that will fit in there is on its way. So it's got a new pair of JJ EL34-2s in it. Everything's biased up very nicely. It should work just fine. Let's give it a little quick sound test. The reverb on these is kind of subtle, but that's probably for the best. You can always add more effects. Marshalls don't need any reverb, in my opinion, but if you want some, it is there. This thing is capable of sounding much better than what you just heard, but I'm doing this through the lav mic right now with the masters barely on so as not to clip everything. And if you want to know what these sound like, there's lots of videos of these. They're good sounding amps. I've had some others on the channel already. The only real downside to this, though it's not a deal breaker, is the tone stack is shared between the clean and dirty stuff. So if you optimize it for dirt, your clean may not be ideal and vice versa. But there's enough of a sweet spot that I don't think it's going to be a problem for most players. So the reverb's not the best. Marshalls don't need a ton, and everyone's got effects. The tone stack is shared. Well, that's pretty common, makes sense at this price point. Can you make music with it? Yeah, you can. And after this repair, this amp should make music for a long, long time. Now, on that note, people have asked, after seeing the first video, does this mean that my DSL40C is going to catch on fire? Is it a reliable amp? I thought you said this was a pretty good amp under $500. It's a fantastic amp under $500. And the new version, the DSL40CR, is a fantastic amp under $1,000. Is it a fantastic amp? No, it's a fantastic amp for that price point. And if it does the sounds that you need it to do, as a working musician, it can be a fantastic choice. The failure mode that this amp exhibited originally was extremely rare. You would have to have both a severe power tube failure. I suspect that when the first failure mode happened, when it lost the bias resistors and the original screen grid resistor, the previous owner to the one who has it now might have had the incorrect fuse in the amp, and that probably laid down a carbon track in the tube socket, and then the tech did not do a very good job. The first replacement screen grid resistor was improperly installed, as were the two bias measurement resistors. And between the bad screen grid resistor installation, where that lead could contact other pins, the very poor, unreliable cathode connection there at R67, and possible carbonization existing in the old tube socket, it was a recipe for a time bomb, and that time bomb went off. But as you've noticed, this was not a ton of work to get cleaned up. It's not an expensive repair. It's 2 hours and $10 worth of parts and a new pair of EL34s. That's kind of the cost of playing the tube amp game. So it looks scary, really a pretty minor everyday repair. This amp's going to go back in service. I doubt it will ever have this problem again, and I doubt very many of them out there in the field will have this particular problem. So if that gives you some peace of mind, great.